A lake was drained to build a new plant. The engineers claimed the lake bed was empty. An old farmer ran to stop them. "If you dig another 20 feet, you will destroy what once fed this entire town." No one believed him. The silence of Bitter Creek Valley did not break. It shattered. It happened on a Tuesday morning when the first fleet of yellow excavators rolled over the ridge. They looked like giant insects against the Oregon skyline. Leading them was a man who didn't belong in the dust. Marcus Sterling stepped out of a black SUV. His shoes were polished. His suit cost more than most tractors in the valley. He was the lead project manager for Vortex Power. He didn't look at the mountains. He looked at his watch. Time was money, and the lake was in his way. For 50 years, Coldwater Lake had been a mirror for the sky. Now it was a crime scene. Massive industrial pumps groaned, spitting thousands of gallons of water per minute into the diversion channels. The water line receded an inch every hour. By the third day, the mirror was gone. What remained was a vast, suffocating expanse of gray silt and black mud. The smell hit the town first. It was the scent of rotting vegetation and 1,000 years of secrets being exposed to the sun. Marcus stood on the edge of the newly formed crater. He unrolled a set of blueprints that smelled of chemical ink. To him, the world was a series of lines and angles. His satellite scans had shown anomalies in the lake bed, irregular densities that his lead surveyor had flagged as potential structures, but Marcus had dismissed them as heavy mineral deposits or glacial till. He didn't have the budget or the patience for a deep-core archaeological survey. He had overwritten the warnings in the software, forcing the radar to read the bed as a blank slate. He needed it to be empty, so to him it was. He signaled to the lead operator. A massive crane began to lower its bucket. Then came the sound of a different engine. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of modern hydraulics. It was a low, rhythmic thrum, a rattle that vibrated in the chest. A rusted silver pickup truck kicked up a plume of dust as it bounced down the service road. It stopped 10 feet from Marcus's SUV. The door creaked open. Thomas Miller stepped out. He was 75 years old. His skin was the texture of an old baseball glove, tanned by decades of Oregon sun and scarred by hard labor. He wore faded denim and a cap with the logo of a company that had gone out of business 30 years ago. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked at the mud. He walked to the edge, his boots sinking slightly. He stood there for a long time, silent. He was a man who used words like he used his winter wood supply, sparingly. Marcus approached him, checking his watch again. "This is a restricted zone, old-timer. We've got a schedule to keep." Thomas didn't turn his head. He pointed a calloused finger toward a specific spot in the center of the drained lake, where a small mound of darker silt rose above the rest. "You're digging in the wrong place," Thomas said. His voice was like gravel rubbing together. Marcus let out a short, dry laugh. "I have $40 million worth of equipment and 5 engineers with PhDs telling me exactly where to dig. I think we're doing just fine." "The maps you have don't show what's under the silt," Thomas replied. "If you drop that bucket another 20 feet in that spot, you'll hit the main axle. You'll shatter the heart of this valley." Marcus folded his arms. "There's nothing down there but mud and rocks, Mr. Miller. We've done the scans. It's a blank slate." Thomas finally looked at him. His eyes were a pale, piercing blue. They didn't show anger. They showed a terrifying kind of pity. "Your machines see what's there now. They don't see what was there 200 years ago. My grandfather didn't have satellites. He had a memory, and he gave it to me." Marcus turned away, waving a hand dismissively. "Get him off the site," he told a security guard. "We start the deep excavation in an hour." Thomas didn't resist. He walked back to his truck. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He simply sat in the driver's seat and watched as the first heavy bucket plunged into the black muck. He knew the earth here. He knew its weight. And he knew that some things, once broken, can never be mended. He shifted his truck into gear and drove away, leaving a trail of dust that settled slowly on Marcus's polished shoes. Thomas drove back to his farm in silence. The tires of his truck hummed against the asphalt, a lonely sound in the vastness of the Oregon landscape. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't need the noise. He needed to think. His farm sat on the edge of the valley, a patch of land that had been in the Miller family for 5 generations. It wasn't the biggest farm, but it was the most stubborn. He pulled up to the barn. It was a massive structure of weathered cedar, silvered by decades of rain. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dry hay and old oil. Thomas walked to the back, past the modern tractor he used for daily chores. He stopped in front of a heavy canvas tarp coated in a thick layer of dust. He grabbed the edge of the fabric and pulled. There it sat, a Caterpillar D8 tractor, vintage 1950. It was a beast of raw iron and yellow paint that had faded to the color of a dead leaf. It hadn't been started in 30 years. Thomas ran his hand over the cold metal of the radiator grill. To most it was scrap metal. To him it was an extension of his own arms. He spent the next 4 hours in a ritual of oil and grease. He checked the fluids. He bled the fuel lines. He hand-cranked the pony motor, his muscles straining against the weight of the machine. On the 10th try, the small engine sputtered. A cloud of blue smoke puffed into the rafters. Then the main engine roared to life. The barn floor vibrated. The sound was a deep, guttural growl that shook the very foundation of the farm. It was the sound of history waking up. Thomas wiped his hands on a rag and walked toward the farmhouse. He went to his study, a small room filled with leather-bound books and framed photographs of men with hard faces. He opened a floor safe hidden beneath a rug. Inside was a wooden box. He took out a roll of parchment. It was yellowed, the edges brittle. He unrolled it carefully on the desk. It was a hand-drawn map of the Bitter Creek Valley, dated 1824. There were no GPS coordinates. There were no satellite overlays. Instead, there were landmarks, the Great Oak, the Serpent's Bend, and the Miller's Heart. Next to the map lay a document with a heavy wax seal. It was a land grant, signed by the first governor of the territory. It contained a clause that modern developers had long forgotten, a perpetual easement of the flow. It stated that the water of the lake belonged to the valley, and the structures beneath it were to be held in trust by the Miller family for as long as the creek ran toward the sea. Thomas folded the document and placed it in a leather briefcase. He looked at the clock. It was nearly noon. By now, the heavy excavators at the lake would be hitting the first layer of resistance. Back at the construction site, the mood had shifted. The air was no longer filled with the confident hum of progress. Instead, there was the screech of metal on stone. One of the massive 20-ton excavators was tilted at a dangerous angle. Its bucket was jammed deep into the mud, caught on something immovable. Marcus Sterling stood on the bank, his face turning a deep shade of red. "Pull it out," he shouted over the radio. "Increase the hydraulic pressure." "I can't, sir," the operator shouted back. "The sensors are redlining. If I pull any harder, I'll snap the arm. It's like we've hooked onto the skeleton of a mountain." Marcus grabbed a pair of binoculars. He looked down into the pit. Through the gray silt he could see a dark, jagged shape. It didn't look like a rock. It was too straight, too deliberate. He felt a cold prickle of sweat on the back of his neck. He remembered the old man's words, "You'll shatter the heart of this valley." Suddenly, a geyser of water erupted from the base of the obstruction. It wasn't lake water. It was clear, cold, and pressurized. It shot 30 feet into the air, drenching the workers. "What is that?" Marcus screamed. A junior engineer ran up to him, clutching a tablet. "Sir, we've hit an artesian pocket, but it's not natural. The pressure readings suggest it's being funneled through a man-made conduit. We've breached a pressurized stone chamber." The ground beneath the excavator began to liquefy. The massive machine groaned as it started to sink into the rising slurry. "Get the men out of there!" Marcus yelled. As the workers scrambled up the slippery banks, the rhythmic thrum returned. It was louder now, echoing off the canyon walls. Everyone turned to look at the ridge. The yellow Caterpillar D8 appeared against the sun, looking like a prehistoric predator. Thomas Miller sat in the high seat, his hands steady on the steering levers. He didn't have a hard hat. He didn't have a high-visibility vest. He just had 60 tons of vintage iron and a look of absolute iron-willed calm. He drove the machine down the steep embankment, the metal tracks clattering and biting into the earth. He stopped the tractor 5 feet from Marcus. The engine idled, a low thunder that made the modern machines seem like toys. Thomas didn't get down. He looked at the sinking excavator, then at Marcus. "I told you to stop at 20 feet, Thomas said. "You're at 22. You just broke the seal on the primary diversion tunnel." Marcus looked at the erupting water. "How do we stop it? If that hole gets any bigger, the whole basin will collapse. We'll lose the site." "You won't just lose the site," Thomas replied, his voice cold. "That water is connected to the valley's underground aquifer. If you don't plug that breach correctly, the town's wells will run dry by morning, and then the flood will hit the lower farms." Marcus stepped forward, his arrogance replaced by a desperate, frantic fear. "What do you want? Money. We can pay you. Just tell us what to do." Thomas reached into his briefcase and pulled out the old map. He didn't look at Marcus. "I don't want your money, Mr. Sterling. I want you to step back. I'm going to save this valley, not for your company, but for the people who actually live here." Marcus Sterling wiped the muddy spray from his eyes, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The construction site had transformed into a battlefield of liquid earth. The $1 million excavators sat paralyzed, their sensors screaming in a language of red lights and sirens. He looked at Thomas Miller, then at the leather briefcase the old man held. "You think a piece of paper stops progress?" Marcus spat, though his voice lacked its former steel. "We have federal permits. We have the right of way. Your maps are ghosts, Miller." Thomas didn't flinch. He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper encased in a plastic sleeve. It was a certified copy of the Oregon Territorial Charter of 1844. He held it out, not with a flourish, but with the steady hand of a man who knew the truth was on his side. "Section 12, paragraph 4, Thomas said. His voice was a low rumble that carried over the groan of the sinking machinery. "The preservation of vital flow. It states that any structure designed for the communal distribution of water, like the Bitter Creek Mill, is a sovereign entity. It cannot be altered without a unanimous vote from the local council. You told the council this lake bed was empty. That makes your permits a lie." Marcus's face drained of color. "That's an ancient law. It's been dead for a century." "Actually, Mr. Sterling, it's very much alive," a voice said. Marcus turned to see Sarah Vance, the valley's sharpest property attorney, stepping out from the passenger side of Thomas's truck. She had been there the whole time, recording the entire exchange on her phone. She held up a tablet displaying a live court injunction. "I filed an emergency stay based on the 1844 charter 2 hours ago. My office just confirmed the judge signed it. You're not just trespassing now, Marcus. You're in contempt of a superior court order. Turn off the pumps or the sheriff, who is currently 5 minutes away, will do it for you." The silence that followed was heavy. Marcus looked from the lawyer to the old farmer. The arrogance that had fueled him for months evaporated, leaving behind a man who had built his empire on a foundation of ignorance. Marcus looked down into the pit. The water was now a violent vortex, sucking the gray silt into a dark, yawning maw. A massive, blackened timber beam, hard as iron and thick as a man's chest, was beginning to emerge from the muck. It was the heart Thomas had spoken of. "How do we stop it?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking. "If that hole gets any bigger, the whole basin collapses. We'll lose everything." "Your machines are too heavy," Thomas replied, stepping toward his vintage Caterpillar D8. "They use brute force. They'll just accelerate the collapse. This doesn't need a sledgehammer. It needs a surgeon." Thomas climbed into the high seat of the 1950 tractor. He didn't use a headset. He didn't check a screen. He placed his hands on the worn iron levers, feeling the vibration of the engine as if it were his own pulse. The D8 roared. A cloud of black smoke billowed into the Oregon sky, a defiant signal to the sleek, silent electric machines around it. Thomas shifted into gear. The tracks bit into the slippery embankment. While the modern excavators slid and floundered, the D8 crawled with the slow, inevitable power of a glacier. Thomas didn't drive blindly into the center of the muck. He knew the stone spine, a submerged Roman-style road the original builders had laid down to service the mill. While the modern heavy-pressure excavators had ignored the old road and sunk into the soft silt, Thomas aligned his tracks with the hidden granite path. The D8 groaned, its metal cleats biting into the submerged stone just inches beneath the mud. He maneuvered the heavy iron blade with the precision of a surgeon, using the tractor's low-geared torque to nudge the keystone. He wasn't fighting the mud. He was using the valley's own forgotten bones to stabilize his machine. One slip off the hidden path would swallow the D8 whole, but Thomas drove by memory, feeling the stone through the levers. Marcus and his engineers watched from the rim, breathless. They saw a man using a tool from a forgotten era to fix a problem their satellites couldn't even see. It was a dance of iron and history. With a final guttural groan from the caterpillar, the stone ceded home. The vortex slowed. The erupting water died down to a trickle. Thomas had plugged the breach. As the silt settled and the water receded, the true scale of the discovery became clear. It wasn't just a pile of old wood. As Thomas used the D8 to gently clear the remaining mud, a cathedral of timber and stone emerged from the depths. The Bitter Creek Mill stood nearly 30 feet tall. Its massive water wheel, carved from ancient cedar, was almost perfectly preserved by the cold, oxygen-free silt of the lake bed. But the engineers noticed something even more incredible. Beneath the mill lay a complex network of stone-lined channels and wooden sluice gates. "My God," one of the junior engineers whispered, looking at his tablet. "Look at the flow patterns." Thomas climbed down from the tractor, his boots heavy with mud. He walked to the edge of the timber structure and placed a hand on it. "It's not just a mill," he said to the gathered crowd. "It's a regulator." The engineers realized Thomas was right. The mill was the centerpiece of an ancient hydraulic system. It didn't just grind grain. It managed the entire water table of the Bitter Creek Valley. The sluice gates were designed to open and close automatically based on water pressure, preventing floods in the spring and storing water for the summer droughts. For decades, the town had suffered from mysterious basement flooding and seasonal dry spells. The modern drainage systems Marcus had installed had only made things worse because they fought against the natural flow. The old mill was the brain of the valley, and the experts had been about to lobotomize it. Marcus stood by the timber beam, his mouth agape. He realized that if he had destroyed this structure, he wouldn't have just broken a law. He would have triggered a catastrophic failure of the valley's water system that his company would have been liable for the next century. The blank slate he saw on his maps was actually a masterpiece of 1800s engineering. He looked at Thomas, the man he had called a relic. The old farmer hadn't used a single computer to save the project. He had used a memory, a map, and a machine that refused to quit. The truth was laid bare under the Oregon sun. The past didn't need to be replaced. It needed to be understood. The Oregon sun hung low in the sky, casting long amber shadows across the hollowed-out lakebed. What had once been a pit of black despair was now an archaeological marvel. As the silt continued to dry, the true genius of the Bitter Creek Mill revealed itself. It wasn't just a building, it was a machine the size of a cathedral. Marcus Sterling stood at the edge of the timber frame, his expensive leather shoes ruined beyond repair. He stared at the junior engineer's tablet. The screen showed a frantic red and blue map of the underground water currents. "The old man was right," the engineer whispered, his voice trembling. "The mill's foundation is built into a natural limestone siphon. By breaching that seal, we've created a pressure vacuum. If Mr. Miller hadn't seeded that keystone, the siphon would have reversed. It wouldn't just dry out the wells, it would have collapsed the entire basin's integrity. causing a massive landslide that would have taken the main highway and the northern school district with it. We were minutes away from a geological disaster. Marcus looked at Thomas. The old farmer was standing by his caterpillar, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that was darker than the mud. Thomas didn't look triumphant. He didn't look like a man who had just saved a town. He looked tired. "How did they know?" Marcus asked, his voice hollow. "How did they know how to build this in 1820? Thomas walked over, his gait slow and steady. He pointed to the massive cedar wheel. "They didn't have computers, Mr. Sterling. They had time. They sat by this creek for 3 winters before they laid the first stone. They watched how the water moved. They listened to the ground. They didn't build to conquer the valley. They built to live with it." The engineers began to realize the magnitude of their error. The ancient sluice gates weren't just relics, they were perfectly calibrated valves. By restoring the mill, they had inadvertently solved the town's flooding problems that had plagued the valley for 50 years. The modern drainage pipes Vortex Power had installed were fighting the earth. The mill worked with it. The discovery hit the news by sunset. Satellite trucks from the city began to arrive at the ridge. But they didn't want to talk to the CEO in the suit. They wanted to talk to the man in the faded cap. They wanted to see the Iron Surgeon who had saved the valley with a 70-year-old tractor. The hammer of justice fell 2 weeks later. It didn't happen with a shout, but with a series of quiet, devastating phone calls. The board of directors at Vortex Power had seen the footage. They had seen the legal injunction. Most importantly, they had seen their stock price plummet as the world watched a multi-billion-dollar corporation almost bury a town out of sheer arrogance. Marcus Sterling was sitting in his temporary office, a trailer on the edge of the site, when the final call came. He was stripped of his project lead status. His fast track to the vice presidency was gone. He was being reassigned to a desk job in a windowless office 3 states away, pending a full federal investigation into his permit applications. He walked out of the trailer to see a group of men in dark suits. They weren't his lawyers. They were state investigators. They began seizing his hard drives and his perfect blueprints. Marcus looked out at the lake bed. The project was dead. The energy plant would never be built here. Thomas Miller was there too. He was sitting on the tailgate of his silver truck, drinking coffee from a thermos. Sarah Vance, the attorney, stood next to him. She handed Marcus a final folder. "Vortex Power is hemorrhaging, Marcus," Sarah Vance said, her voice like ice. "The footage of Thomas saving the valley has gone viral. Your CEO is in damage control mode and the board of directors has decided you're the sacrificial lamb. They've signed a preliminary agreement to halt the project indefinitely and fund the restoration of the mill. It's not out of the goodness of their hearts, it's because their stock price dropped 10% this morning. They're paying into a trust for the town just to avoid a class action lawsuit they know they'll lose." Marcus looked at Thomas. "You win, old man. You got your pond back. You got your money." Thomas took a slow sip of his coffee. He looked out at the valley, at the trees beginning to turn gold with the coming autumn. "It was never my pond, Mr. Sterling, and I don't want your money. I told Sarah to put every cent of that settlement into the local school and the volunteer fire department. I have everything I need right here." Marcus was escorted to a waiting car. He looked back one last time. He saw the townspeople, farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, descending into the lake bed. They weren't there to work. They were there to touch the wood of the mill. They were there to reclaim their history. The man they had once ignored was now the man they circled, shaking his hand, offering him thanks he didn't ask for. 1 year later, Coldwater Lake was a mirror again. The water was clear, deep, and still. But now, in the center, the top of the Bitter Creek Mill rose proudly above the surface, protected by a new stone breakwater. It had become a state landmark. The mill in the lake drew visitors from across the country, but it did something more important. It kept the valley safe. The wells were full. The basements were dry. The rhythm of the water was back in balance. Thomas Miller sat on his porch as the sun dipped behind the Oregon pines. His Caterpillar D8 stood in the barn, clean and oiled, a silent sentinel of the battle they had won. He didn't have a plaque on his wall. He didn't have a trophy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, notched wooden coin, a mill token from 1850. He turned it over in his rough fingers. We live in a world that tries to tell us we are replaceable. It tells us that our stories don't matter, and that the past is just an obstacle to the future. But they are wrong. You are the guardian of your own history. You are the only one who can stand up when the engineers of the world try to drain what makes you who you are. This story isn't just about a lake or a tractor. It's about the soul of a man who knew his worth. It's about the power of standing your ground when everyone else tells you to move. If you've ever felt like your voice didn't matter, if you've ever felt like the world was moving too fast and leaving the good things behind, then you belong here with us. We tell these stories so that the old Toms of the world are never forgotten. Subscribe to this channel. Not for us, but for the legacy we all share. Let's make sure that when the next generation looks back, they find a foundation that was built to last. Thomas stood up and stretched his back. He heard the distant, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the water wheel turning deep in the heart of the lake. It was a steady sound, a permanent sound. He walked inside his house and turned off the lights. The valley was quiet. The mill was turning. And for the first time in a long time, the Miller family slept in peace.